The call came late at night, the kind that makes the air feel heavier, like the world has shifted under your feet. Andrew had been exhausted from a long day at work, his muscles aching from hours of managing a stubborn construction project. But the moment he heard the officer's voice, every ounce of fatigue vanished. Jessica was gone. A car accident, they said. A collision on the freeway. No survivors. The words blurred together, becoming background noise to the sudden ringing in his ears. His wife, his Jessica, was dead. Just that morning, she had kissed him goodbye, her perfume lingering on his shirt as he left for work. And now, she was gone. Shock numbed him at first. The kind of numbness that makes everything feel unreal, like watching someone else's tragedy unfold. He went through the motions, calling family, answering endless questions from the police, making arrangements for a funeral he never thought he'd have to plan. Jessica's family collapsed under the weight of grief, her mother inconsolable, her father stone-faced but broken inside. Friends reached out with empty words of comfort. The funeral home overflowed with sorrow, the air thick with whispered condolences. Andrew stood at the center of it all, drowning in the weight of loss, forced to accept a reality he didn't want to believe. Paperwork consumed the weeks that followed. Death certificates, legal matters, financial accounts frozen and reopened under his name. The life they built together had unraveled into signatures and cold transactions. The house felt emptier, quieter. Her clothes still hung in the closet, untouched. Her favorite mug sat by the sink, waiting for a morning that would never come. Nights stretched endlessly, sleep refusing to come. Instead, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how life had shifted so drastically. Jessica was supposed to be there. She was supposed to grow old with him, argue about what to watch on TV, complain about his forgetfulness. She wasn't supposed to be a memory. Time blurred. 1 month. Then 2. People stopped calling as often. Sympathy faded, life moved on, for everyone except him. Then came the 3rd month. It was supposed to be an ordinary day. A quick stop at the cafe near his work, a desperate attempt to shake off the morning fatigue. The scent of roasted coffee beans filled the air as he stood in line, barely registering the hum of conversation around him. And then he saw her. Jessica. Alive. She sat by the window, sunlight catching the soft waves of her dark hair, her hand delicately wrapped around a coffee cup. Her laughter rang out, light, carefree, the kind of sound that used to make his worst days bearable. She wasn't alone. The man across from her was tall, well-dressed, confident. His expensive watch gleamed under the cafe lights. He leaned in slightly, his eyes locked on hers, the kind of gaze Andrew recognized all too well. The intimate kind. The kind a man gives to a woman who belongs to him. His stomach twisted. His wife, his dead wife, was sitting there, alive and laughing like she hadn't buried him in grief. Everything around him faded. The sounds, the movement, the smell of coffee. Time slowed, stretched, warped into something unnatural. He couldn't breathe. She was supposed to be gone. Buried. Mourned. Yet there she was, living a new life, a new identity, as if he had never existed. His pulse pounded against his skull, disbelief and rage colliding in a violent storm inside him. He wanted to move, to walk up to her, to demand answers, to make sense of the impossible. But his feet stayed planted. She didn't see him. Didn't sense the weight of his stare. She was too busy twirling her hair, smiling in a way that made his chest ache with something beyond anger. Betrayal. It hit him harder than grief ever had. Jessica hadn't died. She had run. Andrew sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The cafe window framed Jessica perfectly, smiling, radiant, alive. His mind refused to make sense of what he was seeing. 3 months ago, he had buried his wife. He had stood over her grave, numb with grief, as dirt was tossed over her casket. And yet, here she was, sipping coffee like she hadn't left a hole in his life. Every instinct screamed at him to storm inside, to drag her out, to demand an explanation. But something stopped him. The laughter on her lips, the way she leaned into the man across from her, the sheer ease with which she existed in this new life, it told him everything. She hadn't been forced into hiding. She wasn't a victim of some mistake. This had been planned. Andrew forced himself to drive away, the image of her laughing face burned into his mind. The grief that had clung to him for months hardened into something colder, sharper. Betrayal had a way of carving out whatever warmth remained, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. By the next morning, he had contacted Mark, a private investigator known for uncovering truths people preferred to keep buried. The man had come highly recommended, someone who didn't ask unnecessary questions and had a knack for digging up secrets. Days passed in a blur of tension and waiting. Andrew found himself barely functioning at work, going through the motions while his thoughts spiraled. At night, sleep became an afterthought, his mind replaying every moment leading up to Jessica's supposed death. Had there been signs? Clues he had ignored. The way she had seemed distracted in the months before the accident, the sudden need for late-night drives, the hushed phone calls. All things he had chalked up to stress, never suspecting that she had been orchestrating her escape. When Mark finally returned with his findings, Andrew wasn't ready for the depth of the betrayal. Jessica's death had been nothing more than an illusion. She had staged the accident meticulously, using a stolen body from the morgue. A woman of similar build and features, someone unclaimed, whose death had been overlooked. The car crash had been arranged to make identification difficult, the body burned beyond recognition. Dental records had been falsified. A forged death certificate sealed the deception. It had been in the works for over a year. The man in the cafe, Brian, wasn't just some new fling. He had been in her life long before she died. Mark traced their connection back to secret weekend trips, hidden bank transfers, and a second phone registered under a fake name. Jessica had been siphoning money from their joint accounts, preparing for her escape while Andrew remained blissfully unaware. The life insurance payout had been the final step. A large sum deposited into an offshore account under a new identity. Jessica Holt no longer existed. But Jenna Reynolds, a woman with a fresh set of identification, a new home in a nearby city, and a lover by her side, was very much alive. Andrew read through the reports, each page another knife to the gut. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair. It wasn't just about the lies. It was about the months of grief she had forced him to endure. The funeral. The condolences. The night spent drowning in loss. She had let him suffer, no, worse, she had engineered it. The last remnants of heartbreak dissolved, leaving behind only cold, seething rage. Jessica had gone to extreme lengths to erase him from her life. Now, he would make sure she regretted it. Andrew stared at the folder in front of him, each document a testament to Jessica's deception. Fraud. Identity theft. Insurance fraud. She hadn't just betrayed him, she had committed crimes that could put her behind bars for years. He could have taken the evidence straight to the police, let the justice system handle her, let her life unravel through legal channels. But that wasn't enough. Not for what she had done. Jessica had carefully constructed her new life, wiping him away as if he had never existed. She had let him mourn her, let him drown in grief, all while she started over with her lover. She had taken everything from him. Now, he was going to take everything from her. Andrew worked carefully, methodically, ensuring every piece of the plan was set in motion. First, he brought everything to the authorities. The investigators were eager to take the case. Insurance fraud of this scale wasn't something they ignored. With Mark's help, they had bank records, phone logs, even video evidence of Jessica alive and well. The legal wheels were turning. Arrest warrants would be issued soon. But the real masterpiece was still to come. Andrew arranged for a public memorial service in Jessica's honor. A final tribute to a beloved wife, daughter, and friend, celebrating the life she had left behind. The invitations went out to everyone, her family, their mutual friends, former colleagues, even old college acquaintances. The local newspaper ran a piece on the grieving husband's heartfelt efforts to honor his late wife. A touching story of love and loss. He made sure the event was unmissable. The venue was a grand hall, one Jessica would have adored. White flowers lined the stage. A slideshow played softly in the background, photos of their life together, vacations, anniversaries, their wedding day. People would arrive expecting closure, a moment to say goodbye one last time. What they would get was something else entirely. To ensure Jessica took the bait, Mark subtly spread rumors in the places she was known to frequent. Whispers of inconsistencies in her death, of an investigation reopening. A quiet murmur of doubt surfacing, suggesting that Andrew was starting to suspect something. Jessica had always been arrogant. Calculated. But also reckless when she felt threatened. Andrew knew she wouldn't be able to resist seeing for herself. The final invitation was sent in the form of an anonymous message. A simple note slipped under the door of the apartment she shared with Brian. He knows. It was all the bait she needed. The funeral home was packed. Rows of solemn faces filled the space, a sea of black attire and whispered condolences. White lilies, Jessica's supposed favorite, lined the casket at the front of the room. A large framed photograph of her rested on an easel beside it, her wedding picture, the one where she had been smiling at Andrew like he was the only man in the world. A lie in its purest form. Andrew stood before them, hands gripping the edge of the podium, the weight of 100 sympathetic eyes pressing down on him. He had played the grieving husband for months, but tonight, for the first time, he embraced the role with full conviction. His voice, steady but heavy with emotion, wove a eulogy that dripped with double meaning, a tale of love, loss, and ultimate betrayal. He spoke of second chances. Of people who take what isn't theirs. Of those who wear masks so well that even those closest to them never see the truth until it's too late. Muffled sobs filled the room. Jessica's parents sat near the front, her mother dabbing at her eyes with a trembling hand. Friends nodded along, absorbing the weight of his words, unaware of the storm about to break. In the back of the room, unnoticed by most, two figures slipped in through the doors, Jessica and Brian. They were careful, staying in the shadows, hidden among the mourners. Jessica's hood was pulled up, her posture tense. She hadn't come to grieve. She had come to confirm. To see if Andrew truly suspected anything, or if the rumors that had reached her were nothing more than paranoia creeping in. But Andrew knew. He had known she would come. The moment stretched. Suspense crackled in the air. Then, he called out her name. A single word. Loud. Clear. Unmistakable. Jessica froze. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Gasps filled the room, one after another, cascading into a storm of disbelief. Someone choked on their drink. A woman let out a strangled scream, hand flying to her chest. Then, silence. Jessica stood at the back, completely exposed. Her hood had slipped down, revealing the very much alive face of the woman they had all mourned. The horror in her eyes was instant. She had been seen. Not just by Andrew. Not just by Brian. But by everyone. Shock and panic warred across her features as she took a step back, fingers curling as if she could somehow clutch onto her vanishing escape. The sheer audacity of the moment paralyzed her. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had planned everything. She had been so careful. Murmurs turned into full-blown chaos. Her mother screamed, hands flying to her mouth. A chair scraped violently against the floor as someone stumbled backward. Jessica's father, normally a quiet man, turned ashen, his body visibly shaking as he clutched his chest. Somewhere in the madness, Brian made the split-second decision to run. He turned sharply, trying to bolt for the exit, but it was too late. A chorus of commanding voices cut through the noise. The air cracked with authority. The police were here. Officers surged forward. Jessica's moment of frozen horror shattered as she lunged toward the door, but hands were already on her, pulling her back, twisting her arms behind her. Brian barely made it 3 steps before he was tackled to the ground. Cameras flashed. The media had been waiting for this. Reporters snapped photos as Jessica was dragged through her own funeral, hands cuffed, face twisted in disbelief. Andrew watched it all unfold, calm, measured. The moment he had been waiting for. Jessica had faked her death. Now, the world watched as she paid the price. The courthouse steps were a battlefield of flashing cameras and murmured speculation. Reporters jostled for space, microphones thrust forward, voices blending into a chaotic mess of shouted questions. The trial of Jessica Holt, or rather, Jenna Reynolds, as she had tried to reinvent herself, had become a spectacle, a scandal that gripped the city with morbid fascination. Jessica had thought she could disappear. She had thought she could erase her past, slip into a new life without consequence. But now, standing before a judge, shackled at the wrists, the reality of her downfall was undeniable. The charges were stacked against her: insurance fraud, identity theft, obstruction of justice, falsification of legal documents, conspiracy. Each one read aloud like the tolling of a bell. She sat stiffly in the defendant's chair, her once perfectly composed face hollowed by exhaustion and humiliation. Gone was the woman who had laughed over coffee, believing she had left her old life behind. What remained was a fraud, exposed and cornered. Brian had fared no better. The moment he saw the investigation turning against him, he had tried to run, a desperate, clumsy escape attempt that ended in handcuffs. His involvement in Jessica's scheme made him an accomplice, and prosecutors weren't feeling merciful. With fraud on such a large scale, both of them faced serious prison time. The insurance company moved swiftly, filing a civil lawsuit to recover the payout Jessica had fraudulently claimed. Every dollar was accounted for, traced through offshore accounts, seized by authorities. The assets she had stashed away, the illusion of security she had built, were stripped from her piece by piece. Andrew had followed the trial in silence, watching from the back of the courtroom as Jessica's world collapsed around her. He had no reason to speak. The truth had already spoken for itself. The final verdict was a foregone conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming, the deception impossible to explain away. When the judge's decision came down, Jessica barely reacted. Maybe she had already come to terms with the inevitable. Or maybe she had simply given up. The sentence was long enough to ensure that by the time she saw the outside world again, the life she had tried to steal back would be nothing but a memory. Outside the courthouse, the chaos of reporters intensified. The cameras, the flashing lights, the bombardment of voices trying to extract some emotional reaction from him. Andrew smirked. Just enough for the cameras to catch it. She wanted a new life, he said, the words slow and deliberate. Well, she got one, behind bars. The reaction was immediate. The perfect soundbite. The final nail in the coffin of Jessica Holt's public disgrace. He didn't wait for more questions. Didn't care for the endless analysis of how a woman could go to such lengths to fake her own death. He simply turned and walked away, free from the weight of her betrayal. For the first time in months, he could breathe. The house felt different when he returned. Not haunted. Not tainted by the presence of a woman who had planned her escape while he had been blindly devoted to her. It was his home again. There were no more lies to uncover, no more deceptions lurking in the shadows. The battle was over. And he had won.